Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by Amanda Burgauer, the SNP candidate in Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale, and by Anthony Salamone from the Scottish Centre on European Relations. Good morning to both, well, good afternoon now, sorry, to both of you. And our first story today is the tragic death of 39 migrants in a truck in Essex. These people are now believed to have come from Vietnam. The driver, Maurice Robinson from County Armagh in the north of Ireland, faces 39 counts of manslaughter, conspiracy to traffic people, conspiracy to assist unlawful immigration and money laundering. The investigation has since spread across the Irish border, throughout England, across continental Europe and indeed into Vietnam. This is, one of the most tragic stories we've heard in quite some time. One of the largest numbers of deaths of migrants, and really shows how big this problem is across Europe, and particularly for us here in the UK. So I guess the first question is, what do we make of this? What's your feeling about how this story has played out so far? Sorry, Anthony, I'll come to you first.
Okay. Yes. No. It's an incredibly sad story, tragic for the victims and the families involved. But I think it underlines. Well, first of all, this is an international story, a European international story. It involves actors, as you said, in perhaps Vietnam, obviously in Britain, and indeed in Ireland and elsewhere. And that underlines the importance of European international cooperation, including through the European Union. The European Union has a whole host of mechanisms for police cooperation, for judicial cooperation through Europol, Eurojust, European arrest warrants. All of that makes it easier to try and deal with situations like this when they happen, but also try to prevent them as well, which underlines the importance of being in the European Union and working with European international partners.
And we have heard today. There's a story from the Guardian that this is the European Migrant Smuggling Centre, which is part of Europol, has been a big part of this investigation. They're kind of taking a lead on much of the European aspect of this, and this is an agency that we're likely to withdraw from as part of leaving the EU. We will talk a bit more about Brexit later, but on this front, what do we do about this issue of people trafficking in the UK? Are the laws that we have in place enough? Are there things that we could do differently to either discourage people from coming or to help the people that are here and that are affected by this?
I think, first of all, it's really important to stop using the word migrants and remember that these were people who died in tragic circumstances. And the reason that they were there in the first place is an economic one, in that they left Vietnam, it would appear, as economic migrants, wanting to come here to make a better life for themselves. I think it's really important that we understand how desperate people are from all areas of the world and why they make these really dangerous journeys, whether it's coming, wherever they're coming from, whichever part of the world they're coming from. The kind of standards of living that we have here are obviously always going to attract them. And I think that we need to look at the world picture in terms of improving the economies in some of these countries so that they do feel that they don't need to put their lives at risk in order to be able to have stable home lives and make a good living for themselves.
And do you think that would be enough? We hear a lot from kind of some of the right-wing rhetoric around migration. We hear about pull factors, about how people benefit tourism, and these kind of tropes that we get from the right wing.
I think there's another aspect of this, and that is about the slavery aspect of it. We don't know yet, and we can't really speculate too much on this particular case. We know that it seems from accounts from parents that a lot of money was spent in order to be able to bring some of these people over. So this might not be a case, but we do know that there are cases within the UK, and particularly in Scotland, where people are brought over and made to work in more or less slave-like conditions. And that's something where I believe we really need to maintain our focus here in Scotland. We need to have the police resources to be able to investigate these things. And we also need an awareness amongst the general public so they know what to look for and can report on suspicious circumstances. Because I do believe there are a lot of people living in conditions that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, we heard in this particular case, there's one report saying that something like £11,000, which to someone in rural Vietnam is a vast amount of money.
Absolutely.
So clearly there's a level of desperation there that's, it's not just, oh, well, like things will be better in Britain. It's things must be pretty bad where you've come from in order to go through this really arduous journey. So we've seen a few other arrests. There's a couple, an Irish couple living in Warrington who have been arrested on, again, conspiracy to traffic people. One other person arrested in Dublin yesterday. It does seem that these are potentially quite well organised gangs that are operating these networks. How can we start to kind of break these down? What do you think? What steps do you think need to be taken to start dismantling these organisations?
Well, I don't think there are any easy answers or easy solutions. I mean, obviously, police and criminal justice organisations across Europe and the world have been trying to combat human trafficking, modern slavery, and so on. And I agree with Amanda that it requires an all-community response. Of course, the police and the criminal justice apparatus are going to focus on tackling crime, which is their role. But in terms of everyday society, I mean, there are employers that are employing people in these slave-like conditions. There are consumers who are interacting with them in some form. We all have to try and do what we can to see that and then feed that through to the police and authorities. But just to come back on the point you mentioned about Europol and the UK's access to it, it's very difficult to see how the UK, which is an extremely important part of both sending and receiving this vital intelligence information that's used by police forces across Europe and beyond, it's very difficult to see how the UK can have the same kind of access to Europol and the other agencies that it does now. If you look at Denmark, which is an EU member state, which is not fully integrated into that part of the European Union, it was extremely difficult for it to even have the most basic degree of access to Europol and Eurojust by agreement of the other EU member states. And so the UK would be even further removed from that. So it's hard to see how, if Brexit happens, that the UK could still be part of this vital intelligence information sharing. But I also, maybe if you come back to the point you mentioned about this conflation that the far right makes so often between pull factors versus sort of benefit tourism and so on. And I think they deliberately try to conflate the movement of people in these circumstances, economic migrants from out with Europe who are driven by desperation, versus EU citizens moving within the European Union. I mean, those are two completely different things. EU migration is completely lawful, and it's an intrinsic part of being part of the European Union, and there is nothing wrong with it. And indeed, it's not necessarily an issue in other European countries, as it has been historically, of course, in the UK. So these are two completely different things, one of which is not a problem, the other one clearly is, and needs solutions, and obviously can have tragic consequences.
Yeah, and of course there's also the question of refugees, which again are another category of people who may be trying to come to Britain. I mean, in situations like this, though, is there a case, do you think, for treating people leaving extremely poor countries as almost like economic refugees rather than as just economic migrants? Do you think there's a case for thinking of those people like this who are coming from very, very poor countries trying to find some sort of better lives for themselves as refugees rather than as just economic migrants, the way we refer to them now?
I think it sounds very easy to say, oh yes, let's just open the doors and let everybody be here. But that isn't a realistic response, given what we know about conditions, especially around the equator, likely to happen as a result of the climate emergency, and how many people are going to have to move from where they currently live. Just saying, oh yes, open the doors and let people in, probably isn't the right opportunity. And this is why I was talking about we need to help people stay where they are. We also need to do something to help a lot of people in refugee camps around the Mediterranean to return to their countries, because it is not sustainable having people living in these dreadful camp conditions. But that has to be an international response. It's not something that we here in Scotland can do all off our own bat. And there needs to be a lot more international effort, I believe, and some long-term planning. We can look at the climate emergency and see what's likely to happen around the world and the additional pressure that that's going to put on economic migration. And there really needs to be an international strategy that's going to take care of things for the next 20 years and beyond. It's no use us just looking at one particular little group, much as though there's some personal tragedies in there. We need to have much more sustainable solutions for all of this.
And given the context of Brexit and everything else, what role can Britain play in that as we kind of retreat into ourselves a bit more? What role can Britain, do you think, play in that international effort?
Well, I think it's important to remember in the first instance that the UK has done comparatively little vis-a-vis the other EU member states in taking refugees, for instance, from Syria or elsewhere in the region. The UK government, when Theresa May was Home Secretary and then when she was Prime Minister, placed a huge emphasis on contributing money to support people staying in the region. So, for instance, Syrian refugees to stay in Turkey, to not as wholeheartedly contribute to the life-saving missions in the Mediterranean, and not to take refugees into the UK. Whereas obviously Germany took hundreds of thousands of near 1 million people. Sweden and Finland and other countries have done the same. So the UK's contribution to this European so-called migration crisis was not as substantive as it could have been, and that was obviously while the UK was a member of the EU. Outside the EU, it's difficult to say because we have no clue what the future relationship could be like between the EU and the UK. But you have to hope that it's one where the kind of cooperation that exists now could be continued. But it reflects, I think, the debate on what kind of country the UK it wants to be. Is it one that fully participates in the international community and does its fair share in its own neighborhood to help deal with situations as they arise? I think if you look at other sort of situations that have happened in Europe and elsewhere, particularly in Ukraine, for instance, the UK has played a much smaller role than it would have previously. If you look at the Minsk agreements, they're trying to broker peace in eastern Ukraine. The participants to that were Russia, France, and Germany, and obviously Ukraine itself, and not the UK. The UK would have been there before. So this problem of disengagement long predates Brexit, and I think Brexit will only intensify that. And it's hard to see how the UK and UK politics as they're presently constructed can find a way back to being a fuller participant in all the global problems that we face.
And just before we move on to talking about Brexit in a bit more detail, there's a statement here from Bishop Nolan of the Catholic Church's Justice and Peace Commission, and he goes into quite a bit of depth on the problems that have been created, for example, by the dismantling of the jungle camp at Calais, some of the hostility of the French government. We've also seen quite significant hostility to various kinds of migration across Europe recently. The EU hasn't necessarily given the most support to Greece and Italy, who have faced the bulk of the wave of migration coming from the Middle East and from North Africa. What could the EU be doing more of to help handle this, as you say, the migration crisis?
I think the EU needs to take a longer-term perspective and to rediscover its solidarity. So much of the response to the so-called migration crisis has been about managing flows of people and reducing immigration. If you look at the deal with Turkey, where the EU handed over billions of euros in exchange for Turkey basically stopping people from emigrating any further and keeping them in Turkey, or the deals that the EU have done with countries in North Africa, particularly Libya, to try and to keep people in those transit countries or to send them back to those transit countries. That is not a humane response. That is not a response that shows solidarity with people who are clearly leaving because conditions are so bad that they are looking and need somewhere else to go. The European Union is about countries working together to try to make Europe and the world a better place, and I don't think the EU has necessarily put itself in the greatest light by the response to the crisis as it's unfolded. So the EU needs to take a more strategic perspective and say, we can be more altruistic and more humanitarian in our responses. We can note that we face, almost all countries in the European Union face demographic decline and aging population. And in fact, incomers would actually do quite well to boost the economies and populations of the countries of Europe. And if the EU wants to be a good neighbor to all the countries of the European neighborhood, it needs to follow through on its principles. More than play to short-term interests or populist parties or the far right, and to think about what Europe is really supposed to be about.
Mm-hmm. Now, just moving on a little bit to Brexit a bit more generally, we've had some further developments this week. We have seen that Boris Johnson did eventually send his letter, even if it wasn't signed, and the EU has accepted it, even though it wasn't signed. The EU is still mulling over how long an extension to offer. The most parties, it seems, would be okay with the end of January. France, again, is showing some resistance to that. But as far as the actual causes of Brexit, we talked a little bit about this attitude of Britain disengaging from certain international affairs over a longer period than just the last three. And historically, there's a kind of idea that Britain always wanted to be in the EU to make sure that it didn't work. I'm not sure exactly how true that is, but it's an idea that I know that a number of European people believe. So, to what extent do you think Britain is just more xenophobic, more hostile to outside influence than other countries?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's that. I think that the UK has always had a different relationship with the European Union, and that's obvious. The fact that the UK didn't join what was then the European Economic Community when it began, and then when it applied, its multiple applications were vetoed by the French. So the UK was not there from the beginning, and obviously didn't have as much influence in shaping the EU. It's one of the reasons why the EU institutions, the way in which the European Union operates, is much more francophone than if the UK had been involved. And of course, I don't. I mean, it's a difficult discussion, to boil down. But I suppose it's that there are many countries in Europe that had imperialist pasts, and I think the UK has found it in that degree more difficult to adapt to the fact that it's not as important as it used to be. And for most of the countries in the European Union, they recognise that is their fate as well, and the only way to hope to have an influence in the world in terms of shaping it in a way that reflects perhaps European or basic values is to work together. And for whatever reason, that just never percolated into the British political system. Every country had its reasons for joining the European Union. It was not all about creating, peace and harmony in its own right. For France, it was about maintaining influence in Europe and stabilizing Europe. For Germany, it was about rehabilitation. For the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, it was about rejoining Europe and the wider community after the fall of communism. For countries like Spain and Portugal, it was about reclaiming European democracy after dictatorship. Every country has its reasons. What were the UK's reasons for joining the EU? I don't think it was about making things difficult for other countries. I do think it was about economics. And of course, we know that so much of the Brexit debate is about economics and trade. What kind of trading relationship we have, doing trade with other countries. That is very important, sure, but that is not all the European Union is about. It's about values, it's about social policies, it's about trying to create a social model, a European social model that is sustainable in these times. It's about addressing common challenges like climate change and indeed migration. So, the UK was always, we have this phrase that the UK was an awkward partner in Europe, and I'm sure that's true. But I don't think that means that Brexit is or was inevitable. Other countries in Europe and the EU also have challenging relationships with the Union. I mentioned Denmark. Denmark has a number of opt-outs from EU policies, just like the UK does. It has its own Eurosceptic movements, and of course, countries across Europe do it as well. So it's not true to say that all the other member states are fully signed up to European integration and so on. No, there's always division and within the different member states. But I think they're more bought into a common vision of what the EU perhaps should be, even if it's not always. And for whatever reason, the UK never fully signed up to that.
And Amanda, when we talk about the British system and how British politics works, I mean, this is something that you're hoping to go headlong into potentially very soon. So what influence do you think, or rather, what influence would you like to have on that culture if you are in Westminster potentially for a while?
So I think actually to understand Brexit properly, we have to look at the political systems. And across Europe, even though they might not always agree, other countries might not always agree, they are used to a much more collegiate politics. And we really are the only people who run this two-party, very adversarial, very combative political discourse. And I think that actually is one of the reasons that we find it quite difficult to be a good partner within the EU, because we don't understand that discussion in the round, the airing of opinions to reach compromise. I think if we look at the House of Commons, sometimes it's very competitive, and it really is about winning and getting to the end, crushing the opposition, and that, of course, does not fit in the European method of politics. So it's very difficult. And as to why why Brexit was ever even put forward, I think that really a lot of that is about the economics. Did people, until probably the Brexit referendum happened, probably had never actually seen the European Parliament at work. I've noticed that it's far more likely now that you'll switch on the television and there you'll be in the European Chamber. Whereas before the referendum, we scarcely saw any of that. Mm-hmm. So for most people, that whole European Union or the European Parliament was very removed from their day-to-day experience. What they were experiencing were the effects of austerity. Mm-hmm. And that and that meant, I still believe, that a lot of that 2016 vote was really people just wanting to point out how angry they were. Mm-hmm. They weren't particularly, I don't think, aware of all of the issues, but they certainly were feeling austerity from the sharp end, recognising that we didn't have enough investment into public services. And all of these kind of things were quite easily manipulated, I think, by the Leave campaign. And that doesn't mean to say that, that's all changed and everybody now would vote to remain. We don't know that. Without a second referendum, we don't know that. But I do think that the anger amongst people, the feeling that they were being left behind economically and socially, really affected that vote a lot. Mm. We still basically have a country that's ruled by elites, whether they're political elites, the wealthy elites, and normal people in the street do not feel that decisions are being made in their best interest. Mm. And for me, I think Brexit is a result of that.
And when you talk about how easily manipulated people were, what role do you think the British media have in that? I mean, the BBC came under quite a bit of criticism during the referendum campaign and before, and obviously we have newspapers that have headlines about crushing the saboteurs, and even every time England play Germany, there is some sort of racist trope on the cover of the Sun. Yeah. To what extent do you think the media have at least facilitated?
Okay. I think we have to be careful in saying that people are easily manipulated, because I don't think they are. I think people, they are surrounded by the opinions and what have you of both their peer groups, of the media and what have you, but saying that they're easily manipulated probably doesn't do them justice. We need to understand just how powerful some of the influences upon us are, whether it's the media or whether it's social media or whether it's just the need to be a part of our social grouping. And so there obviously were some strange things that happened during the referendum campaign. I think we will probably continue to find out more and more about that. But when we look at, the migrant poster that Mr. Farage stood in front of and things like that, this deliberate confusion between EU freedom of movement and migrants coming in to take over the country, the feeling from many people that I've spoken to that the reason that our NHS is overstretched is because of all of these people moving here, rather than the fact that we've had decades of underinvestment, and without our EU citizens helping to support the NHS, it's going to be even a lot worse, just because we don't have the people. So I think we've got to be very careful when we try and decide why people made the choices that they did. I think it's quite complex, and I do think that media has a role to play in that, but then we have to look at the ownership of the media and why the media takes the positions that it does.
And Anthony, sorry, what's your feeling on that? I mean, I have friends in Europe who have told me that the British media kind of alarms them in how partisan our newspapers can be, how some of the TV news is constructed. What's your feeling on that? Do you think that Britain's media is somehow different from what we see elsewhere?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways the British media is different from other European or international media, but I wouldn't. I don't think you can say that the media were responsible for shaping or framing Brexit in and of itself. And when you look at print media, yes, of course it's very polarized, but people are more likely to read newspapers which espouse views that they already subscribe to. I mean, if you during the referendum campaign, if you read the Guardian versus if you read the Daily Mail, you'd sort of know what the editorial line would be. It wasn't a surprise to anyone in that sense. When it comes to the broadcast media, I think that they had their responsibility to try to be impartial and to present both sides. And I think broadly speaking, most broadcast media did do that as they thought they should have done it, which is to say that I think there was a false perception among the BBC or other broadcasters that the way to fairly represent both sides was to give equal time and equal coverage to both sides, and that wasn't accurate. I mean, if the vast majority of economists, for instance, would tell you that leaving the European Union would be damaging to the UK economy, the way to balance that is not to have one economist who will tell you that, and the 1 in 100th economist who disagrees, because that creates a false sense of balance. If 99 people say one thing and one says the other, and you put them right next to each other, it makes it look like they're equal, and in fact they're not. So I think there were definitely different ways that the BBC and others could have made it clear while there were two sides of the campaign, while they both had positions they were trying to articulate, that one was vastly different from the other. And I think that certainly created an impression that wasn't there, that leaving the European Union was more normal than it was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, unfortunately we do have to move on. We will probably mention it again in a little while, but I just wanted to move on a little bit to this story that just emerged late last night, alleging that the Islamic State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has been killed in a US military operation in Syria. Donald Trump tweeted late last night that something major had happened, and he's expected to make a statement very shortly. Unfortunately, we won't hear it. But this is quite a big move. This is a guy who's been in hiding pretty much permanently for as long as he's had any sort of power. He was the leader of the self-described caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and now it appears that he has been found and killed, at least in part, as a result of Kurdish intelligence. This comes after Trump has come in for huge criticism from all quarters, including in his own party, for abandoning the Kurds in northern Syria. We talked about this crisis earlier in the week on Scotland at 7. What do you think this news will do for Donald Trump politically?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to make plain that Donald Trump does not have a foreign policy. I think oftentimes that we give him infinitely more credit than he's due, in the sense that there is a plan or there is a strategy. He clearly just does whatever comes to his mind and whatever he tweets, which is deeply damaging both to the presidency, but of course to the U.S. itself. He's an extremely polarizing figure, and everyone knows that. I think what's most interesting, particularly since he said that he wants to seek re-election, is that he concentrates very much in the domestic politics on his base. And he has seemingly never tried to grow that base substantially. So his base like him very much, and presumably whatever he does, they will like him. The question is the rest of the electorate, and particularly obviously the crucial sort of swing voters in key, or middle voters in key swing states. What do they make of his misadventures as American president? And I can't imagine, that this news, as opposed to any other story, will have much resonance. I mean, obviously it's a significant development, but if you contrast that with the extraordinarily rapid decision to withdraw troops from northern Syria, enabling the Turkish offensive, ceding that seemingly sphere of influence to Russia, which, as you mentioned, according to the American establishment, is deeply damaging to U.S. interests. I can't see a way of trying to pretend that Donald Trump's foreign policy does anything good for anyone other than perhaps him.
Mm-hmm. And Amanda, you brought up just before we came on air this tweet that Donald Trump had put out back when Bin Laden was killed, that he'd said, Obama didn't kill Bin Laden, the Navy SEALs did. I somehow doubt he'll be taking the same approach to the death of al-Baghdadi. I'm sure he will want to take 100% of the credit. So again, the same question really to you. What do you think this does for Donald Trump's reputation?
I honestly don't think that it will change minds very much at all, because we've already got this very polarised state. And just as we were talking about the media here, you can see the same polarisation between the media in the States as well. I think what's more important, what's more interesting, is both our armed forces and American armed forces have worked closely with the Kurds. And most of those troops were absolutely horrified at Trump's decision to abandon the Kurds and allow Turkey to move in. And I think that Trump has quite a lot of core support within armed forces, or started off with that. Mm-hmm. But this is the kind of move that actually will start to erode his base within the military. Let's face it, he's not only seceded political and geographic space to Russia through this, but he's also abandoned a group of people who were very strong allies to our initiatives in the Middle East, and I really regret that. Yeah.
This all comes on top of course, the ongoing impeachment inquiry. There's a story from the Guardian here about John Kelly, his former chief of staff. He had said he felt bad for having left Trump's side because his advice hadn't been followed, and that the president therefore might face impeachment. And speaking at an event the other day, he said, "Whatever you do, don't hire a yes man, someone who won't tell you the truth. Don't do that, because if you do, I believe you will be impeached." To which, and this is incredible, Trump apparently replied, "John Kelly never said that. He never said anything like that. If he would have said that, I would have thrown him out of the office. He just wants to come back into the action like everybody else." And then the press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, said something that sounds like it came from a North Korean press spokesperson. It said, "I worked with John Kelly, and he was totally unequipped to handle the genius of our great president." It's as you say, this kind of polarization that's happened in the States. It's become really quite intense. There's this The impeachment is being held behind closed doors at the moment, which the Republicans are fuming as, a kangaroo court because people can't see it. But those rules to hold it in secret were passed by Republicans. Meanwhile, the Democrats are trying desperately to make a fuss about Ukraine while trying to ignore the fact that, Joe Biden's son is involved in this Ukrainian energy company in circumstances that may not be entirely legitimate. So what do you make of the whole impeachment process? Do you think there's any chance of it being successful?
I think there may be, but I think that we would do well to stay out of other countries' politics and let them get on with it. We've got our own issues to deal with here.
Well, I think that this impeachment process is a long time coming. Right? I mean, this was ever since the Democrats retook control of the House, there was pressure on Speaker Nancy Pelosi to move forward with impeachment. She had always resisted that because of the fact that we take over the Democrats' agenda, and that there is not a majority in the Senate. I mean, we know that if impeachment proceedings begin, there is not a majority in the Senate to convict Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So we can go through the motions and have the process and have the trial, but we know what the outcome will be. And there's the risk that Trump will be able to successfully use the impeachment process as fuel for his campaign. Mm-hmm. The Democrats are out in a further witch hunt, as he brands every inquiry, and contribute to his extraordinary powers of creating misinformation that is believed. Mm-hmm. If the House votes to proceed with impeachment, then obviously that will be a big issue. The question also is how long it will take. Presumably you'd want it wrapped up before the election. The election's in 2020. So it's a high stakes gamble for Democrats. It's not a simple issue. Yes, we don't know what the outcome will be. I suppose it would this way. It would take something extraordinary to convince Republican senators, or enough of them, to convict a Republican president. We have to wait and see.
Yeah, it is an ongoing story. We will keep following it. But meanwhile, in several parts of the world over the last few weeks and even months, we've seen a host of essentially pro-democracy demonstrations. We've seen the big protests in Hong Kong, initially over the extradition treaty, but then extending into several other issues. We've seen protests in Catalonia, basically sparked by the imprisoning of political prisoners there from the Catalonian independence movement. We've seen protests in Chile. We've seen protests in Lebanon. What do you make of this kind of movement around the world of these kind of big uprisings? Is there something happening in the world, or is this just a coincidence that all these things are happening right now?
Well, I think it's hard to apply broad brush analysis to all of these different countries, because obviously there are particular circumstances within each of them. But I suppose maybe we could say that technology plays a role in enabling people to organize themselves more efficiently using social media. I certainly think that is a trend. Also, perhaps that younger people are getting more involved in politics and public life, which is great, because obviously we've been concerned about people disengaging from politics, not voting, not demonstrating, and so on. And of course, challenging circumstances, difficult situations. I mean, very different from democracy in Hong Kong through to the trial and imprisonment in Catalonia, through to economic desperation in Chile. I mean, they're all different circumstances. But if people are finding common cause because of these various factors, I suppose that makes sense. I think in the European context, there's a question of how the EU responds or doesn't respond. I think it's disappointing, but not entirely surprising, that the European Union, in terms of the institutions, but also the various member states, have had extremely little to say about Catalonia, about the conviction of the political leaders there, and they're being sent to prison for holding a referendum. I don't think it doesn't make the EU look very good at all, does it? And I think it's disappointing. And I think in the longer term, the European Union will have to think more deeply about how it responds to these situations in member states, and moves beyond the line of, well, it's an internal matter, we can't comment. I mean, that's not what the European Union is about. I mean, the European Union is countries who have voluntarily agreed to integrate themselves politically and economically, and if you decide to do that, and if you're part of a family of nations and of people, it is not only right, it's the responsibility of other states to call things for what they are when they're happening. And I think that's a reckoning that the EU will have to face at some point.
And Amanda, we've seen various different responses to these. I mean, unsurprisingly, in Spain, the police response has been somewhat heavy-handed. We've also, unfortunately, seen a handful of Catalonian protesters becoming a bit more violent in a historically very peaceful movement. And Spain has taken about the hardest line it can in that situation. In Hong Kong, on the other hand, the extradition treaty has now been withdrawn, but the protests continue, again looking at things like universal suffrage and an amnesty for the protesters that have already been arrested. In Chile, quite a big package of measures were offered, including a guaranteed minimum income, and changes to the tax system, caps on electricity prices. I mean, this was all a protest that was sparked initially by a rise in subway prices. So these different responses, how do you think governments should be responding to these kind of mass protests?
I think you picked some really interesting examples, and this goes back to this point about how, what the history of these individual countries is. Because if you look at Spain, Spain was under fascist dictatorship before it joined the EU. And so we may be seeing a bit of reflection of that in some of the attitudes. If we look back at Chile, again, not that long since they were under dictatorship, in my living memory anyway. So the responses to government and the kind of protests are going to be different in those countries. But I also am very aware of, it wasn't that long ago that we were sitting talking about the Arab Spring. And you've seen a repression within Egypt and other countries since then. So I think it's very difficult to just say, oh yes, people are protesting pro-democracy. I think actually it's a lot more complicated than that, and that each country we need to look at in depth about, what are the historic terms of what's really going on there. Hong Kong, again, very different situation, because that's a country that we handed back to China as part of our imperialist past. And people there have got an expectation of democracy of some form or another. And now, of course, you've got this conflict between the Chinese state and the people of Hong Kong, who are not necessarily sharing the same vision there. So again, very different from what's happening in Spain or in Chile or anywhere else. And we must be careful not to just lump them all together, I think. We need to have much more nuance in our understanding of what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, we will keep an eye on all of those stories in the coming weeks, but we have now to come back to the UK, and something that I'm sure you have quite a bit to say about. There is now what seems quite likely that there will be a general election sometime relatively soon. There has been a bit of to and fro on precisely when. The Tories are aiming for the 12th of December, and they're talking about a bill to make that happen on Monday. But the Lib Dems and the SNP seem to have come to some sort of agreement to make it happen on December the 9th instead. They plan to introduce a bill to basically amend the Fixed Terms Parliament Act and fix the 9th of December as the date. They don't trust Boris Johnson to stick to anything that he says about when an election might happen, and they worry that there may be a backdoor to a no-deal Brexit. So if this election happens, obviously you will be a candidate. You'll be facing David Mundell. What's your feeling on when this will happen and how an election might happen?
I think I can speak for other members of the SNP when I say the sooner the better, because we really need to have this election and to try and at least have some say over the future of our country, because at the moment that isn't happening. So in terms of when, sooner the better. Obviously, December is not historically a great time to have an election because of the dark and the weather. It will make it a bit harder for everybody to be able to get out there and campaign on the doorsteps. But that will be the same across all parties, so I don't think that that's really a handicap to anybody. Who can judge what the outcome for Scotland is going to be? But what I would say is that talking to people on the ground, they are very keen to get this election done with, and it's because they do not consider our current situation to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And what are you hearing in your constituency? Are people, obviously every constituency in Scotland voted Remain, but you're in one of the Tory strongholds. Obviously David Mundell for quite some time was the only Tory MP in Scotland. He now unfortunately has some colleagues, but yeah, do you get the feeling that this Brexit mess has started to change some minds on how they might vote?
So I think there's a few things that we need to say to that. In 2015, Mr Mundell only won by 800 seats. Mm-hmm. And about that number of seats went to the Green Party. So 2017 was a bit of an exception, and possibly because people were pretty scunnered after the 2016 referendum. Mm-hmm. Certainly our vote was down a lot in 2017. So I don't think that we can make any assumptions about how the vote is going to go in Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale. What I would say is that people understand how devastating Brexit is going to be, especially for rural Scotland, and DCT is a predominantly rural constituency. It's also a constituency where we had food processing and the Pinnies plant that was closed down in Scotland because of incentives made to persuade it to move to the northeast. Mm-hmm. And people in Annan are pretty angry about that. We've got other, food and drink is a big part of our export market. So we've got a lot of people who are very angry about their markets being closed off. We still don't know what kind of access we're going to have to markets. For some of these businesses, just a couple of months disruption puts them out of business. We're not talking about businesses with millions in the bank. We're talking about mainly small businesses that employ local people, where the supply chain is absolutely crucial to them. So I think that will make a difference. Certainly talking to people on the doorstep, there's quite a lot of anger about it, given that Mr Mundell voted to remain in the EU himself and made a big thing about it, and has now subsequently voted with the government for no deal Brexit, for a deal, for whatever. So local people really feel that they're not being listened to, that their voices aren't being heard, and I think that will have an influence on the election.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, obviously this election has an enormous European context, not mm-hmm. least in the fact that when it happens may be in part determined by what the EU decides over the next couple of days about a delay. Mm-hmm. Do you have any insight on what they might be thinking?
Well, I don't know what the European Council will decide, but I think it's more likely than not that the EU will go for a medium or longer extension, so at least until the end of January 2020, but perhaps longer. And we know that the main obstacle to a longer extension is France, and that France was unsympathetic to the idea of a longer extension back last spring. Mm-hmm. But I think at the end of the day, France will fall in line with the other member states. If only because it's crucial and really matters to frontline countries like Ireland particularly, but also to Belgium, also to the Netherlands. These are the countries that would be most directly impacted by a no-deal Brexit mm-hmm. on day one or day zero. So I think that France will agree to that eventually. I should say the reason why the date was October 31st to the 1st of November as the original Brexit extension is because that aligns with the new term of the European Commission. It was supposed to be. It's been delayed because several of the candidates have been rejected by the European Parliament. It's been pushed back until the beginning of December. But the EU likes to fix dates that align with its policies and programs and so on. I don't think anyone in Brussels actually ever expected there would be a Halloween Brexit. They would have thought that either the UK would have passed the deal a fourth time and left early, or that there would have been a further extension. And indeed, the original thought in Brussels when Theresa May asked for an extension back in March would be that they would have given the UK a year from March to March. So I don't know what will happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if the extension offered perhaps was longer than January. I think at least January and perhaps longer, maybe even to March or beyond that, so that EU leaders don't have to keep coming back and giving further extensions. There isn't no real limitation under Article 50 as for how many extensions you can have or how long they should be. But from the EU perspective, they want to get Brexit over with if it's going to happen. I think there's a perception sometimes in the UK that the EU, the rest of the EU, just want the UK out, and that I don't believe that's true. I think they want Brexit to be over with, but if the UK, through, for instance, a second referendum, decide to remain in the EU, I don't see why the other member states wouldn't welcome that, even though it would be awkward for the UK, given that it's given up all of its political influence in the European Union, and doesn't have really a say at all in how the EU functions anymore. It would be difficult to go back to being a normal member state if the UK ever was one. But I can't think of any country in the EU that wouldn't welcome stopping Brexit.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you make that point about France being the kind of holdout, while obviously Ireland is the one saying, no, we have to get a deal sorted out. But France clearly would be affected quite significantly as well. I mean, Dover to Calais is the busiest crossing in the European Union, one of the biggest crossings in the European Union. So why is it that France is resistant to this?
Well, I think the main reason is that Macron has a very particular vision of what he wants the European Union to be. He's clearly in favor of a more federal Europe. He wants to further integrate the Eurozone, to create a Eurozone budget, which the EU is sort of doing, to perhaps create eventually a Eurozone parliament, or even a European finance minister, similar to the EU foreign policy chief. He's in favor of transnational lists. It's the idea that when you have a European Parliament election, you'd have members of the European Parliament that were elected by people from different countries in Europe. So he's set out several major speeches on how he wants the EU to go. So some of that is that he has a vision for what he wants the EU to be. And I think from his perspective, Brexit distracts from the EU figuring out where it's going to go next. And try to get Brexit over with as soon as possible allows the rest of the EU to move on. Now that's a point of view, but I mean the EU is a multitasking institution. It's always been that way. The EU can deal with more than one thing at once. The EU institutions have been very successful in ring-fencing Brexit and trying as much as possible to stop it from taking over the rest of the EU agenda. The EU said that from day one that they wanted to do that, and they've broadly been successful in doing that. So I think that Macron's view is a point of view. But it's certainly not the majority view in the other member states. In the end of the day, France will go along with everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And from your perspective, obviously an election, this election is likely to be fought in large part over different visions of how Brexit is to be handled. There's going to be the Tories either proposing Boris Johnson's deal or no deal. The Brexit Party obviously will be looking more towards no deal. The SNP are looking for to somehow stop Brexit if possible, and also to pursue independence. The Lib Dems are saying just stop Brexit altogether. Labour have a somewhat fuzzier position. What do you think? What do you think is the likeliest outcome? I mean, I know this is a very difficult thing to guess, but what's your feeling at the moment?
Well, I think a useful starting point, and we know this well, but it's worth saying, is that the atmosphere, the political environment in Scotland is completely different from the rest of the UK, or indeed from England. So, opinion polls suggest that the SNP would pick up seats and would do better than it did in 2017 out of the election, and that's not surprising. given that the 2017 was a very unusual campaign, where the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon had announced the possibility of an independence referendum, that didn't happen, and then it was very confusing what the SNP message was in the 2017 election. Was it Brexit? Was it on independence? Was it against the Conservatives? Was it against austerity? There were very different messages. Now we know that this time, whenever a general election comes, it will be a twin vision of independence referendum soon plus stop Brexit from the SNP. So it's a clearer message, and perhaps will probably resonate better, particularly since confusion and frustration with Brexit have grown quite a lot since 2017. For the other parties in Scotland, that are connected with their UK parties, I think it's a question of how much they will be willing to differentiate themselves from the UK parties. I mean, if UK Labour have once again a confused, fuzzy picture on Brexit of trying to appeal to Remainers and trying to appeal to Leavers, will the Scottish Labour Party go along with that, or will they try to articulate more directly a Remain message, given that Scotland voted to Remain and would clearly, according to opinion polls, vote Remain again if there were a second EU referendum? And for the Scottish Conservatives, I think they've already made that choice. They have clearly fallen into line with their UK party as opposed to having a distinct message, and I can't imagine that will do very well for them. As for the Scottish Liberal Democrats, they've got their 4 seats. I don't know the opinion polling in East Dumbartonshire, but it would be quite interesting whether or not Jo Swinson would be able to hold her seat and thus continue as leader of their UK party. But their position on, yes, we want a Brexit referendum, but we don't want a second independence referendum, I think that's a difficult situation for them to sustain. So no, it'll be fascinating to see what the Scottish results are generally. As for the UK one, well, opinion polls on general elections haven't seemed to have been very good. If you look at 2015 and 2017, both of them underestimated how well the Conservatives will do. So perhaps we might see something similar this time, that despite all of the frustration around Brexit, that voters, mainly in England, when they look between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, will vote for Boris Johnson because of their dislike of Corbyn when it comes to sort of bellwether seats or so-called shy Tories. Yeah. We may yet see that again, despite everything that's happened.
And Amanda, as one of the potential beneficiaries of a swing to the SNP, although I don't know how much of a benefit it is to have to go and spend time at Westminster right now, what's your feeling on the overall picture? Do you think that there's a chance of Tories being swept from power and Corbyn somehow being able to fashion a government? And perhaps more importantly for us and our viewers, do you think that the message that an independence referendum is necessary and is going to happen, do you think that is going to resonate with the people of Scotland?
Yes, I think we've got some extremely good candidates standing in the blue bits on the map, especially across the south of Scotland. On either side of me, we've got 2 people who were actually elected in 2015 and are now looking to go back, Callum and Richard, who were very good constituency MPs, and I think people have noticed and missed them in their absence. Really, this general election is about giving people a choice, letting them decide, because we didn't get to decide on Brexit. And I think that people are beginning to notice that if you look at the votes across the UK, England voted for Brexit, that's what it seems to be getting. Wales voted for Brexit and will be taken along with England. Northern Ireland we've made special arrangements for, so their Remain vote is almost being honoured. But Scotland, who voted absolutely to Remain, has been ignored and has not been a part of the discussions and debates. And I think however people voted, either in the last general election or in the European referendum election, people are beginning to see that is not very democratic. And I know that people will talk about this being a UK vote, but given that there is no provision for Scotland's voice being heard, I think that this general election could very well be seen as a mechanism for that. And if so, I look forward to it.
Well, whatever happens, I'm sure both of you are going to be extremely busy over the coming weeks. So good luck to both of you. Thank you both very much for joining us. And to those of you at home, thank you for joining us as well. We would just like to remind you again that making TV programs is an expensive business, and we are working on a very small budget here. So every penny that you can help us with makes a big difference. You can see on the screen right now, you can become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter at broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Your £5 a month can make an enormous difference. We are trying to expand the kind of programs we make, the number of programs that we make, but we can't do that. We can't do that without money, especially as this election comes up. We want to do really proper election coverage, and we will need some help to make those kind of things happen. So if you're able to support us at all, please do. Don't worry if you can't. Programs will always remain free to view. So again, thank you to Anthony, thank you to Amanda, and thank you to you for joining us. I've been Kenny McBride. This has been The Full Scottish. Thanks a lot.